What's up, Power 106.3 FM listeners? I'm your host, Mr. Animated, and this is Dee's Corner, all things literary.
What's up, all my fellow readers? I'm your host, Mr. Animated, and this is Dee's Corner, all things literary. This week we will be reading Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. As always, my lovely co-host, Miss Noddy from Meeting in the Laser Room. How you doing, Miss Noddy?
I'm good. How you doing, Mr. Animated?
I'm actually doing pretty good today. Could be better, could be worse.
Absolutely. Still topside, so no complaints. It's a beautiful day here in Louisville, Kentucky. Today was a beautiful, beautiful day. So I'm kind of excited. I know we've been focusing on the Once Upon a Time series, and we decided to give that a little bit of a break because we're going through it pretty quickly here. We're already in season 3.
Yeah.
And so, I thought this was kind of a good book selection because the people who did not even know there was a book or a book series per se had no clue about this. This movie kind of came out during this time period where a lot of books were being turned into movies, a lot of fantasy novels and young adult novels. But I felt like it kind of gave me some reminiscence of Once Upon a Time because of how they did the time period thing and saying that there was these two realities. So I felt like it was a good, little choice.
There was one thing in the book and Once Upon a Time that actually connected in a bit.
Okay.
When Ruby could turn into the big bad wolf.
Okay.
Miss Peregrine and or the others who take care of peculiar children, they can turn into birds at will, just like Ruby can turn into a wolf.
Yeah, that there is connection. Then, like we said, the alternate realities, the children having these peculiar powers or things of that nature. And then, of course, the big bad villains.
In this book, this is an entire book series, folks. Like, you would not believe how many books there are about this.
Yes, so let's go ahead, shout out our sponsors, and then let's jump into talking about the book.
Our sponsors for this week are Merrywell's Media Brand Group, Diamond Elite Design and Customs, and Matters of the Heart Natural Products and Essential Oils.
Yes, shout out to Matters of the Heart. We actually just got some butters and things from Mr. Germain, so definitely shout out to Matters of the Heart Natural Products and Essential Oils. Diamond Elite Designs and Customs, we just got some fresh t-shirts, so shout outs to them. And always our main sponsor, Merrywell's Media Brand Group. Thank you guys for sponsoring and keeping us around. All right, so let's go ahead and get into talking about the book. So Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children is a contemporary fantasy debut novel by American author Ransom Riggs. The story is told through a combination of narrative and vernacular and found photography from personal archives of collectors listed by the author. This book was originally intended to be a picture book, featured photographs Riggs had collected, but on the advice of an editor at Quirk Books, he used the photographs as a guide from which to put together the narrative. He was a collector of photographs, but he needed more for the novel. So then he met somebody named Leonard Lightfoot, a well-known collector at the Rose Bowl Flea Market, and was introduced to other collectors. This result was a story about a boy who follows clues from his grandfather's old photographs, tales, and his grandfather's last words, which lead him on an adventure that takes him to a large abandoned orphanage on Carnholm, a fictional Welsh island. The book had been a New York Times bestseller. It reached the #1 spot on the Children's Chapters books list on April 29th, 2012, after being on the list for 45 weeks and remaining there until May 20th when it dropped to the 4th spot on the list. Critics gave great praise for the book, use of the vintage photographs in the sepia style and surrealist form, as well as good characterization and plot settings. So that's the basic information. But as they were saying that basically in the book, there were all these photographs, and the photos led to the story. And so when you see the movie, which more people are more familiar with the movie, you do see these photographs and these letters and these
some things are different
and then the mysterious phone calls and all of that stuff. But in the book, it helped develop it. But I think by the book having such a visual art aspect to it, it helped change it from a novel to be a novelization to a movie, because it gave them direction. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like they still tried to keep those pieces in there, which was kind of like great. So you have, let's see, the Peculiars. I don't know how to pronounce this correctly. The Wyberns. I believe that's what they call them, the Wyberns.
Yes, the Wyberns.
Right. And then we talked about time loops, the aging forward, hollow gas, the rights, the non-peculiars. So there was there's a lot of pieces and people in there.
The Wyberns, they were peculiars of their own, but they all necessarily were just always female. They would always be the ones to create the time loops, take care of the children, and they all had the peculiar ability to turn to different types of birds.
Or animals.
Yes, or animals. Their name necessarily signifies what type of animal they will turn into.
Right.
So, for example, Miss Peregrine. She can turn into a peregrine falcon. There are also non-peculiars, such as the main character's father. I don't know the proper word to use in this scenario. Pretty much, there can be people who have peculiar abilities in a family, but for one generation, it can not.
It was like it skipped a generation is what they explained in the book. Okay, so then there were the sequel books. So we're going to kind of give you guys some information about this because we definitely want to hop into not only reading the book, but also talking about the movie. But there was a sequel called Hollow City, which was released January 14th of 2014, and is set immediately after the first. And it sees Jacob and his friends fleeing from Miss Peregrine's to the peculiar capital of the world, London. The third installment in the series, titled Library of Souls, was announced in early 2015. It was released on September 22nd of 2015. Then there was a new trilogy set called A Map of Days, and it was the first installment of the new trilogy set in the United States. It featured the main protagonist from the original trilogy, which was released October 2nd of 2018. The fifth installment, The Conference of the Birds, was released, and that was January 14th, 2020. It was announced on October 2020 that on February 23rd, 2021, the sixth and final book of the trilogy, The Desolations of Devil's Acre, would be released. And then there is a graphic novel, and then, of course, the film. The film adaptation was released in the United States September 30th, 2016, directed by Tim Burton. The screenplay by Jane Goldman. And there was a few, known actors and actresses in the movie, but, we're not going to quite get into that part. But in the book, let's get into the Peculiar Dome. So, Peculiar Dome is how they describe, the different types of people. So, peculiars, otherwise known as syndegress, a word meaning peculiar spirit in the Old Peculiar language, which is in turn the author's adaptation of Old English or Anglo-Saxon language. Peculiar folk are a branch of humanity possessing a second soul, which manifests itself in strange ways such as abnormal characteristics and abilities, commonly referred to as peculiarities. Very rarely are peculiar children born to peculiar parents, as the essence or gene of peculiarity often skips entire generations, making peculiar population vastly less than that of normal people. The Imrim is a specific type of female peculiar who can transform into distinct birds, control and manipulate time as she sees fit, and govern the peculiar world. Most essentially, the ability to control time lets these women possess a period of historical time by looping it, creating a potentially eternal sanctuary for peculiars. They often set out into the present day world to rescue peculiars in dire situations or to search for those without an emblem. Emblem means revolution or circuit in Old Peculiar. The Council of Emblems is the official government and law of peculiardom. Their responsibilities include maintenance of the loop order, the writing and amending of laws on a regular basis, and the determination of sentences for those convicted of a crime. Members are not specified. So then, they had the time loop. So basically with the time loops, what I took from the book, they touched on it in the movie, but the book went into it a little bit more specifically. Would you say?
Yes, because here's my opinion on it. Can I
describe
what time loops are? Okay, so for the Yimbrins, they specifically chose specific dates.
The perfect day.
Yes, one of the perfect days that they could find. They would make it so that they could always reverse it, but in the movie, I think they also did in the book, Miss Peregrine, she couldn't find the perfect day.
Well, okay, so let's go back. So the Emblems, they picked the perfect day, the perfect time, and they re-loop this time 24 hours. Every 24 hours, they re-loop the time. And this is one to keep all the peculiar children safe. And to give them, this nest and safety. They have themselves hid kind of in plain sight for all time. In this particular book and movie, Miss Peregrine is in charge of these children. She has been in charge of children for centuries at this point. But something happens to where she's not able to have picked the particular best time. Because they were going to be bombed by a World War II fighter jet pilot plane. A bomb was being dropped on them.
Even if that didn't happen, she still couldn't pick the perfect date because they were rushing, and we're going to get to this fact later, but a hologast, it killed one of the children.
Right, so there's a multitude of things that happen within this 24 hours of the time loop that they ended up having to live in for a long time. So they're the fabric, of course, of the peculiar world, or peculiardom, similar to towns and specific locations. They create a vast and quite complex world of varying whereabouts and dates only peculiars are able to enter. When these loops, peculiars live indefinitely without aging or reliving previous experiences, even as the day around them repeats itself. While it may appear to be a form of eternal youth, it is a suspension of time inevitably. In reality, if not all, of Miss Peregrine's children are over 50 years old, but the loop detains them as teenagers and small children physically and mentally. A loop must be reset daily or it will collapse, leaving all peculiars within it exposed to the outside world. So, as a result of these time loops, those who reside in them may not be able to return to the present day, depending on how long they've been there. In a mere matter of hours outside the loop, the amount of time evaded will catch up. An example of this is Miss Peregrine's own former ward, a young girl named Charlotte, who left the loop while Miss Peregrine was away. She was discovered by the police in the mid-1980s and sent to a welfare agency. Miss Peregrine found her just 2 days later. She already aged 35 years. Although she survived the ordeal, the unnatural aging process had caused Charlotte a great deal of mental disorder, and she was sent to live with Miss Nightjar, an embryo more suited for her care. The same process of deterioration applies to anything taken out of time loops, as another instance was an apple Jacob took back to the inn where he and his father were staying in the present day. He left it on the nightstand next to the bed as he fell asleep that night, but by morning he found that it was rotted to the point of disintegrating. So the time loops is kind of like the key piece to everything that goes on in the books, in the movie.
It's also their undoing, in a sense, if they can't reset the time loop.
Right. Okay, so talk about the hologast.
The hologast are peculiars who want to gain immortality. without having to live inside one of the loops. So, one hologast specifically, he decided that he was going to do research and decided that he was going to have to use a Yimbrin for it. So him and several other peculiars, they got together, they took a Yimbrin hostage and used the energy or her life as sacrifice. The experiment went horribly wrong and they all became hologast. As a result, they lost their original human form and became invisible. So, what they decided, the hologast that did the research later found out that if they eat enough of peculiar eyes, specifically children's, they would regain their human form.
And it becomes a right.
Yeah.
The rights. Right, okay. So they got back to their original form, but the thing was that they didn't get back their irises. Like their eyes end up being completely white, correct?
Correct.
And that's why they call them the rights. So the rights were evolved hollows who had got a hold enough eyeballs of peculiars basically to get back to a human form, but they ended up not possessing any type of ability, but were highly skilled and perform as posing as normal people under multiple identities and could pass into the time loops. Much of their existence, of course, became about obtaining these peculiars for remaining hollows to eat. Once they set their eyes upon a peculiar child, they will follow them around as they did with Jacob all the way to the island. So, yeah, I mean, that part alone just was crazy. So, let's go ahead and get into the basics. I don't want to give away the book, though. So, are you reading from the beginning?
Yes, I am. I'm reading from the prologue.
Okay. So, basically, this kid has a grandpa who he is crazy about. Stuff happens with the grandpa, which you guys are going to hear about later. The grandpa gives him these clues. He finds all this stuff, and he goes off on this mission to find out what his grandfather was talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's how he comes upon Miss Peregrine and the children, basically. But what he didn't understand, I think, at the time was the fact that here he is in the 2000-somethings, but they're living in 1943, I believe.
I believe so. I believe that it's 1948, I believe.
Maybe 48. It's something in the 1940s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when he steps into their world, time has went back. So they're trying to get him to understand that they're real. Everything that is happening is real. But he doesn't catch on to it until I can't think of her name. Oh my god.
It is 1940. It's
okay.
September 2nd, 1940.
Okay, well 1940. So until they tell him that only peculiars can step into a time loop, he doesn't realize that he has any peculiarities. So now he's like, wait a minute, how is that possible? There's nothing special about me, da, da, da. Well, they're trying to catch him up to how they know his grandfather, Abe,
mm-hmm.
and why and how and all of this stuff. But Emma is trying to get him to understand everything that he's not normal, everything going on, and she was particularly close to his grandfather. And so when he witnesses what happens with his grandfather, he goes and finds them. He's trying to get answers. You know, they keep telling him not to ask questions, but then it's like they want to tell him stuff. So it's like there's constant conflict of, should we tell him or no, we protect him? Should we let him find out or should we protect him? Like, to me, it seemed like there was a constant conflict of him getting information.
So I'm not trying to spoil the book until I actually read it for you guys. So in my opinion, in your opinion, How do you view the book itself?
I felt like the book gave more information, especially about his grandfather. Especially about the fact that his grandfather had the peculiarity of being able to see monsters or the hollow gas and being able to see certain things that most people, even with a peculiarity, could see. I think that they gave a little bit more background story, especially about the fact that the grandfather had been in Miss Peregrine's loop as a young man. He left, and why he left. Like, they actually go into why he left, what it was he was doing when he left. And that he did keep up with them. And that he was still doing peculiar work, like fighting the hollow gas and things of that nature. And that why he was the way he was, because his family that he ends up having thinks he just doesn't care, he's careless, he goes on these trips and he's crazy, but he actually was like dealing with the peculiar dumb world and at the same time living in the regular world. So they try to say he had dementia. He did not. Along with the other things. I think, though, that the fact that he told Jacob, who at this time is 16, stories as a kid.
To make him be prepared.
He was trying to prepare him, because I think he knew that Jacob was a peculiar. That he had peculiarities. Because, of course, it skipped his children. I don't think that he intended for Jacob to find out the way that he did, but I think that he gave him enough that it enabled him to try to connect the pieces and the dots and put the puzzle piece together to try to go find out what was really going on, what really just happened to my grandfather. And his dad being the son of the grandfather, he of course doesn't understand or know what the heck's going on, but he gets his dad to help him without knowing he's helping him. So I felt like the book gave a little bit more into that dynamic, that family dynamic, because in the movie they kind of glaze over the whole family thing. Like, about his dad and the relationship the dad had with the grandfather and why things were the way. Like, they just kind of mentioned it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like, they only touched on it a little bit.
How I view the book is it tells you that you should pretty much trust family. Trust those that people you love. Trust with almost all their heart. That you shouldn't try to ignore the knowledge that they give you. Because Abe, he wanted to make sure his grandson was prepared for anything in this world. Anything that could possibly happen. While his father, he didn't want his son to end up like his father. So he tried pushing him further and further away from him. But in reality, that just made it harder for Jacob to accept that there are peculiar things in life that happen.
Yeah.
Want to get into this book? Well, I want to get into this book. So,
well, we still got to talk about the movie a little bit, and then we'll say we get into. So. Okay, so here, let's talk about the movie. I love the visuals because how the movie starts off, it's very dreary, gray, dark tones. But when he crosses into the time loop, everything becomes really, 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 really bright. Yeah. And every time he left the time loop,
it became gloomy.
It became gloomy again. I felt like the costumes, the characterization, I felt like they did the characters justice. The only Enoch, nobody liked Enoch no way. But Enoch, The guy who played Enoch, I feel like he did him justice because he made him very unlikable, or it made you be like, well, what's wrong with him? Like, why is he? Who raised you? Why are you like this? Yeah.
With his peculiar ability, it kind of seems like that is the natural thing that will happen to his personality. It gets grimmer. Because, well, I'm going to talk about it anyways when we start reading the book. So, his peculiar ability is to bring life to inanimate and or dead objects.
Mm-hmm.
With the hearts of animals. So, in my opinion, it made it seem like he didn't have a choice but to adopt the personality of being somewhat mean. So that he could protect those that he didn't want harm to befall. So that he wouldn't have to feel like he lost someone he cared about. And so that he probably didn't have to use his peculiar ability to bring them back to life temporarily.
Well, I think the other, I guess, peculiar that I felt they did really good with was Claire. I felt like they, with her character having the second mouth, like, I felt like
in the book, they actually switched that up in the movie. It was the guy who had the second mouth in the book. And it is a guy who has a mouth.
It was Claire, the youngest. You talking about the kid with the bees?
Nope, the guy who had the second mouth. In the book, it shows a picture of a man, and it even says he, with a face paint on the back of his head, but you can see the seams of a mouth.
Okay, well, Claire's character, who is in the book.
I got a guy.
Okay, well, I got a girl. I don't know what version you read, but I'm looking at
It's not the same dude. I don't know.
What was his name?
I'm not trying to spoil the entire book.
Well, some people were able to have the same peculiarity. Like that Abraham and his grandson. So I don't know. So but in the book, the youngest person in Miss Peregrine's house was Claire. She was the one with the mouth in the back of her head. That's how she ate. And I felt like in the movie, though, was what I was saying. Oh, yeah. That character, the girl that they had to play her, she played the role very well. I liked her character. I also liked Olive's character. She's the one with the floats. And she's the one that helps Jacob piece everything together. He becomes friends with Emma, of course, and that connection between her and his grandfather kind of bonded them, because she was able to put in the pieces of his early love life and who he was. But Olive was like the key to everything for Jacob. So I feel like all the characters, the roles were picked out perfectly. And they found children to portray play these children and portray it in a way that made it, if they do decide to continue the series and film, it will make sense. It would have made sense. So that was kind of my thing. Miss Peregrine, I liked who played her. I do like who played her. I feel like they could have gave her more, though, because based off of the book versus, the focus was more the kids than her. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Whereas in the book, I felt like she played a bigger role. So that was just kind of my thing. But let's give a couple facts.
Hold on. Who is your favorite character? Who are your favorite 3 characters from the movie in the book? Well, from the movie and the one from the book.
Olive. Hugh, probably, because Hugh was off the chain. He was a little extra with his high fashion self.
He was suave.
Yeah. I would say Olive, Hugh, and Jacob, probably. Because Jacob's role in both was very almost even realistic. You know, growing up in this family dynamic of there's secrets or like there's something that's holding everybody from being a family the way that they should. Why does my dad treat me or treat my grandfather? You know, like I'm close to my granddad, but what's the problem between the two of them? I don't get it type thing. And life isn't as peaches and cream. To finding out this history, this, you know, this walk of life your grandfather actually had, like he had a whole nother life. To finding out your true part of your true self. I think that the young man who played him did like an excellent job with playing that role.
Okay. Now is this for your movie or book side?
I would say both. I would say Jacob. And then, like I said, far as in the book, I did enjoy Hugh. I feel like Hugh probably could have had a little bit more in the movie.
Ability. It was a bit weird, but it was also very entertaining.
So, okay. So, as we said, the film was released in 2016. It was directed by Tim Burton. And the film was actually filmed in London and the Tampa Bay area. It premiered at the Fantastic Feast in Austin, Texas on September 25th, 2016. It was theatrically released in the United States September 30th, 2016 by 20th Century Fox. It received mixed reviews and grossed $296 million worldwide against a production budget of $110 million. So it doubled its money. For sure. So as the movie starts, Abe is telling stories to his grandson Jake about battling monsters and spending his childhood at Miss Peregrine's home for peculiar children in Carnholm, Wales. The home's children and their headmistress, Miss Amma Peregrine, possess paranormal abilities or are known as peculiars. One day, Jake finds Abe dying with his eyes removed. He tells Jake to go to the loop of September 3rd, 1943.
That's another difference from the book.
So
he follows advice. Well, he goes to...
Well, he tells him about that, but then he talks to the therapist, and then the doctor convinces his father and him that they should go to the United Kingdom, to Carlum, to investigate the children's home, learning that it was destroyed during a Luftwaffe raid. Upon entering the rooms, Jake finds children from Abe's story. They take him through a portal, and he emerges in the year 1943, when the house was still intact. So from there, it goes into Miss Peregrine telling him what she can, telling him, tells him about the time loop and things of that nature. He's introduced to everybody and things of that nature. And so forth goes on the movie and the impending battle that ensues. So, as we said, the books goes on I feel like they should have followed up with this movie. I feel like there should have been at least a part 2.
There might actually be a part 2.
I don't know, because you got to think, this was 2016. This was 5 years ago. Most of all those children are not going to be, they're almost all grown up. They've all changed, and book 2 literally picks up
right after.
So they would have to get whole new actors. I wish they had done it while the actors were still young enough to pull it off.
Maybe a year after, but they would have still necessarily been the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, but remember the whole time loop thing, that when you step out of the time loop, you start aging immediately. So they could have kind of pulled it off with, how long it takes to produce a film and film it and all of that stuff and release it. But 5 years later, there's no way they're going to be able to pull it off without having to replace every actor but Miss Peregrine.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So, but that is what I have. So, do you want to go ahead and get into this book, Mr. Animated?
Let's do it.
All right.
Once again, this is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. I had just come to accept that my life would be ordinary when extraordinary things began to happen. The first of these things came as a terrible shock, and like anything that changes your life forever, split my life into halves. Before and after, like many of the extraordinary things to come, it involved my grandfather, Abraham Portman. Growing up, Grandpa Portman was the most fascinating person I knew. He had lived in an orphanage, fought in wars, crossed oceans by steamship, and deserts on horseback, performed in circuses, knew everything about guns and self-defense and surviving in the wilderness, and spoke at least 3 different languages that weren't English. It all seemed unfathomably exotic to a kid who never left Florida, and I begged him to regale me with stories whenever I saw him. He always obliged, telling them like secrets that could only be entrusted to me. When I was 6, I decided that my only chance of living a life half as exciting as Grandpa Portman's was to become an explorer. He encouraged me by spending afternoons at my side, hunched over maps of the world, plotting imaginary expeditions with trails of red pushpins, and telling me about the fantastic places I would discover one day. At home, I made my ambitions known by parading around with a cardboard tube held to my eye, shouting, "Land ho!" and prepare a landing party, until my parents shooed me outside. I think they worried that my grandfather would infect me with some incurable dreaminess which I'd never recover. Now these fantasies were somehow inoculating me against more practical ambitions. So one day, my mother sat me down and explained that I couldn't become an explorer because everything in the world had already been discovered. I'd been born in the wrong century, and I felt cheated. I felt even more cheated when I realized that most of Grandpa's best stories couldn't possibly be true. The tallest tales were always about his childhood, like how he was born in Poland, but at 12 he had been shipped off to a children's home in Wales. When I would ask why he had to leave his parents, his answer was always the same: because the monsters were after him. Poland was simply rotten with them, he said. What kind of monsters? I asked, wide-eyed. It became a sort of routine. Awful hunched over ones with rotting skin and black eyes, he'd say. And they walked like this, and he'd shamble after me like an old-time movie monster until I ran away laughing. Every time he described them, he tossed in some lurid new details. They stank like petrifying trash. They were invisible except for their shadows. A pack of squirming tentacles lurked inside their mouths and could whip out in an instant and pull you into their powerful jaws. It wasn't long before I had trouble falling asleep, my hyperactive imagination transforming the hiss of tires on wet pavement into labored breathing just outside my window, or shadows under the door into twisting gray-black tentacles. I was scared of the monsters, but thrilled to imagine my grandfather battling them and surviving to tell the tale. More fantastic still were his stories about life in the Welsh children's home. It was an enchanted place, he'd said, designed to keep kids safe from monsters on an island, where the sun shined every day and nobody ever got sick or died. Everybody lived together in a big house that was protected by a wise old bird, or so the story went. As I got older, though, I began to have my doubts. What kind of bird? I asked him one afternoon at age 7, eyeing him skeptically. across the card table where he was letting me win at Monopoly. A big hog who smoked a pipe, he said. You must think I'm pretty dumb, Grandpa. He thumbed through his dwindling stack of orange and blue money. I would never lie to you about that. Jacob. I knew I offended him because the Polish accent he could never quite shake had come out of hiding. So that would become bold and think became sink. Feeling guilty, I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. But why did the monsters want to hurt you? I asked. Because we weren't like other people. We were peculiar. Peculiar how? Oh, all sorts of ways, he said. There was a girl who could fly, a boy who had bees living inside of him, a brother and sister who could lift boulders over their heads. It was hard to tell if he was being serious. Then again, my grandfather was not known as a teller of jokes. He frowned, reading the doubt on my face. Fine, you don't have to take my word for it, he said. I got pictures. He pushed back his lawn chair and went inside the house, leaving me alone on the screened-in Lullen. A minute later, he came back holding an old cigar box. I leaned in to look as he drew out 4 wrinkled and yellowing snapshots. The first was a blurry picture of what looked like a suit of clothes with no person in them. Either that person didn't have a head or was invisible. Sure, he's got a head, my grandfather said, only you can't see it. Why not? Is he invisible? Hey, look at the brains on this one. He raised his eyebrows as if I'd surprise him with my powers of deduction. Millard, his name was. Funny kid. Sometimes he'd say, Hey Abe, I knew what you did today. He'd tell you where you'd been, what you had to eat, if you picked your nose when you thought nobody was looking. Sometimes he'd follow you quiet as a mouse, without no clothes on, so you couldn't see him, just watching. He shook his head. Of all the things, eh? He slipped me another photo. Once I had a moment to look at it, he said, So, what do you see? A little girl, and she's wearing a crown. He tapped the bottom of the picture. What about her feet? I held the snapshot closer. The girl's feet weren't touching the ground, but she wasn't jumping. She seemed to be floating in the air. My jaw fell open. She's flying! Close, my grandfather said. She's levitating. Only she can't control herself too well. So sometimes we had to tie a rope around her to keep her from floating away. My eyes were glued to her haunting doll-like face. Is it real? Of course it is, he said gruffly, taking the photo and replacing it with another. This one of a scrawny boy lifting a boulder. Victor and his sister weren't so smart, he said, but boy were they strong. He doesn't look strong, I said, studying the boy's skinny arms. Trust me, he was. I tried to arm wrestle him once, and he just about tore my hand off. But the strangest photo was the last one. It was the back of somebody's head with a face painted on it. I stared at the last photo as Grandpa Portman explained. He had 2 mouths, you see. One in the front and one in the back. That's why he got so big and fat. But it's fake, I said. The face is just painted on. Sure, the paint's fake, but it was for a circus show. But I'm telling you, he had 2 mouths. You don't believe me? I thought about it. Looking at the picture and then at my grandfather. His face was so earnest and open. What reason would he have to lie? I believe you, I said. And I really did believe him for a few years, at least, though mostly because I wanted to. Like other kids my age wanted to believe in Santa Claus. We cling to our fairy tales until the price for believing them becomes too high. Which for me was the day in second grade when Robbie Jensen pantsed me at lunch in front of a table of girls and announced that I believed in fairies. It was just desserts, I suppose, for repeating my grandfather's stories at school, but in those humiliating seconds I foresaw the mock-inker fairy boy trailing me for years, and rightly or not, I resented him for it. Grandpa Portman picked me up from school that afternoon, as he often did when both my parents were working. I climbed into the passenger seat of his old Pontiac and declared that I didn't believe in his fairy stories anymore. What fairy stories? He said, peering at me over his glasses. You know, the stories about the kids and the monsters. He seemed confused. Who said anything about fairies? I told him that a made-up story and a fairy tale were the same thing, and that fairy tales were for pants-wetting babies, and that I knew his photos and stories were fake. I expected him to get mad or put up a fight, but instead he just said, "Okay," and threw the Pontiac into drive. With a stab of his foot on the accelerator, he lurched away from the curb, and that was the end of it. I guess he'd seen it coming. I had to grow out of them eventually, but he dropped the whole thing so quickly, it left me feeling like I'd been lied to. I couldn't understand why he made up all that stuff. Tricked me into believing that extraordinary things were possible when they weren't. It wasn't until a few years later that my dad explained to me. Grandpa had told him some of the same stories when he was a kid. And they weren't lies, exactly, but exaggerated versions of the truth. Because of the story, Grandpa Portman's childhood wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was a horror story. My grandfather was the only member of his family to escape Poland before the Second World War broke out. He was 12 years old when his parents sent him into the arms of strangers, putting the youngest son on a train to Britain with nothing more than a suitcase and the clothes on his back. It was a one-way ticket. He never saw his mother or father, or his brothers, his cousins, his aunts and uncles. Each one would be dead before his 16th birthday, killed by the monsters he had so narrowly escaped. But these weren't the kind of monsters that had tentacles and rotting skin. The kind a 7-year-old might be able to wrap his mind around. They were monsters with human faces, in crisp uniforms, marching in lockstep. So banal, you don't recognize them for what they are until it's too late. And like the monsters, the Enchanted Island story was also a truth in disguise. Compared to the horrors of mainland Europe, the children's home that had taken in my grandfather must have seemed like a paradise. And so in his stories, he had become one. A safe haven of endless summers and guardian angels and magical children who couldn't really fly or turn invisible or lift boulders. Of course, the peculiarity for which they'd been hunted was simply their Jewishness. They were orphans of war, washed up on that little island in a tide of blood. What made them amazing wasn't that they had miraculous powers, that they had escaped the ghettos and gas chambers was miracle enough. Folks, that was Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. As always, I'm your lovely host, Mr. Animated. This is Dee's Corner, and I will read with you later.